something beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, in the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club. Devil's Chess Club.
Welcome to Devil's Chess Club. I'm Aaron Good. To get early access to episodes of Devil's Chess Club, subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. This episode will soon be available to everyone, courtesy of the new documentary film series, Four Died Trying, which premiered on November 22nd on Apple TV and other streaming services. Four Died Trying explores the extraordinary lives and calamitous deaths of President John F. Kennedy, Malcolm X, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and Senator Robert F. Kennedy. The next episode should be available around New Year's Day, I am told. The filmmakers have had problems getting the rights for archived footage. I suspect that's because there are powerful forces that want to keep our history locked away forever, just like they want to keep all those JFK documents locked up forever as well. But the truth remains the truth, whether our regime wants to acknowledge it or not. I hope you enjoy the show, and deepest thanks again to Four Died Trying. In today's episode, I am joined by Lawrence Wilkerson. This is not Lawrence Wilkerson, obviously. This is Bibi Netanyahu, and he'd probably want to make sure everyone knew that. He is a retired U.S. Army colonel, former chief of staff to U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell, and current distinguished adjunct professor of government and public policy at the College of William and Mary. I'm really grateful to Mr. Wilkerson for taking the time to speak with us. He's a very gracious person, and I think that many years from now, he will be remembered as one of the few U.S. officials to speak honestly about the rot at the top of the U.S. empire. Professor Wilkerson, it's great to have you back.
Good to be with you. Good to be with you.
So you have been a rare person who has, from a position within to or with a foot inside the establishment at one point, being in a presidential administration, you have since become a critic of U.S. imperialism, and I myself have became a bigger critic of U.S. imperialism after Obama was victorious and he continued all those Bush policies. So people have seen the U.S. headed in a very bad trajectory for a long time, a minority. But have you ever seen the U.S. position in the world looking so bad, looking at Ukraine and Gaza right now? And have you ever seen this much just craziness in the U.S. management of the world, or what it was management of its empire, whatever we want to call it?
No, I have not. I've never seen, to put it bluntly, such incompetent leadership. It is incompetent across all three branches for the first time in my knowledge of our history, all the way back to colonial times. The Supreme Court, the Congress, and the executive branch are incompetent, or they are competent in areas where they shouldn't be, whether it's interfering with the economy, which the Supreme Court started doing majorly when it passed Citizens United. We now have the greatest billionaire class, I would say trillionaire class, because it's approaching that in the history of the world, I think, with the exception of maybe some kings and queens back in the old days. The maldistribution of wealth is just humongous in our country right now, much worse than 1929. And of course, the expenditures on our wars now, $33.8 trillion aggregate debt caused partly by that, just make this even worse. So yes, I think it's as ill-managed an empire as history has seen in some time, with the exception possibly of some of them, like the Roman, at the very end. And that's worrisome.
That is very worrisome because they were known for their excesses, but as excessive as they were, they didn't have nuclear weapons. And so eventually their own the own forces of their empire were their own doing, as is normally the case with an empire. Now we have this nuclear issue as well, to where we can't rely on the normal forces that sweep away empires to actually succeed in a way that doesn't get us all killed. I mean, that has to be something that sober people are thinking about.
That's an excellent point. My daughter, who was second lieutenant in the Army after graduating from Georgetown, and then a Secret Service agent when they recruited her away from the Army, now a farm lady, if you will. She said to me the other day something that was really disturbing, because I realized the correctness of what she was saying. Dad, if we go to war with China, as you say, we will lose badly in the first 30 days. Casualties the Americans have never seen before. The ones alive today have never seen before. So we'll go nuclear. We will not want to lose. The American people will not want us to lose. They will not even like the appearance of a loss. I mean, I think we'd win in the long haul, but the long haul might be years. She's right. We would probably initiate the use of nuclear weapons in that circumstance. That's very frightening.
I only disagree with her in that I don't think that we would win. I think it would quickly bring in the Russians, and it would be the end of the world if it were to come to that. So I think it's even worse.
It would be a closer run thing, but I think there was an article written about this about a year ago by a military professional whom I have some respect for. And he just put the two defense industrial base potentials, if you will, what really won World War II for us, against each other, Russia, China, the United States. And while China's looks pretty formidable right now, and ours is falling off every day, China builds 6 ships a month. We can't build one a year, for example. But ours is more robust, more creative, more, shall we say, resilient. And so after, say, 6 months or a year of what would be a conventional war, we would probably be able to respond in a way that we could at least bring it to a halt in a negotiated settlement. But we won't do that, he said. We won't do that. We will be so alarmed and so outraged at the first 30 days we'll go nuclear. I think that's a very, very reasonable assumption given the circumstances. And we're the ones, just check it out, from the ABM treaty during my administration on, who have dismantled every nuclear arms control agreement achieved during the Cold War. There's nothing now. Vladimir Putin is even talking about withdrawing from the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. That would be the last straw, if you will, because probably means that he and Xi Jinping have worked some kind of deal out whereby Xi Jinping, who wants to build out his nuclear weapons complex as rapidly as possible, will get plutonium, high-grade plutonium from Putin, and he'll have to test somewhere. So he could test in Russia underground. I don't know of a really acceptable facility in China, though Xi Jinping would probably do it anyway. But testing would be necessary in that event. And so maybe that's the reason Putin's thinking about, and has said he's thinking about, withdrawing from that final treaty.
Right, that would be a disaster, but you can grasp the position that they're in, where there's a logic to that.
Yes.
I mean, as they say, the U.S. is not agreement capable, and this is, so why even hold on to any of these agreements if there's a chance that they're putting you more at risk of dealing with the U.S., which seems to want to hold on to empire above all else.
And that's the sad reality of it. I think that if I were in their shoes, Xi Jinping or Putin, or for that matter, anybody else in the world contemplating it or even in possession of it, say our allies, I'd be very worried about us in regard to the nuclear situation, which I think next to climate change is the number one threat confronting the globe right now, which tells you something about our priorities. We're over there in Gaza, we're in Ukraine, and the two biggest threats we have, we're wasting trillions of dollars in order to confront minor threats, as opposed to the major threats, which may just take us all out.
Right. Yeah, this is extraordinary, and there are two unfolding spectacles here that are more. They're not in the nuclear realm as of yet, but they have potential there to escalate to that if things went sideways. Um, what's your assessment of what do you think is going to happen in Gaza in the coming weeks, at least, or in the longer term? I mean, I feel that they can kill everyone, or at least most of the place, and flatten it, but the world will be increasingly horrified, and Israel will be more of a pariah than it already is. I mean, what is the end game here?
Bibi Netanyahu has said categorically that he doesn't care about the world's opinion. He's even said that he doesn't care about the opinion of the United States, open parentheses, because I can handle them, close parentheses. I'm not making this up. These are things that he's actually said. I think he had no strategy. I don't subscribe to the theory that they knew this was coming, they knew it was going to be dramatic, and they knew it was going to give them an excuse. Like some said about 9/11 with regard to the United States. There were people who took advantage of it, yes, to react way over what was necessary. But I don't buy that theory that the Israelis planned this. But I do buy the theory that I saw no strategic thought in the beginning, right after October the 7th. Maybe understandably, given the rage it created and Netanyahu's promise to everyone that they had the best security under him that they'd ever had. And that just totally blew that out of the water. Well, what I saw fall into that void of strategy was a strategy. And that strategy is clear from the past based on what they've done in the West Bank in particular. We're starting to do in East Jerusalem and in the Golan. And that is eradicate the Palestinians. So they are now exercising their ability to do that on a whole scale basis all across Gaza. I think his theory here, his strategic theory here is I'm going to eliminate as many Gazans as I possibly can, Palestinians. They're also doing it, of course. This is lost sight of mostly by us right now, still in the West Bank, still in the Golan, and they're getting ready to start it in East Jerusalem in a big way. So they're going to eradicate the Palestinians. That's their strategy. We're going to kill as many men, women, children, dogs, cats, whatever gets in our way as we possibly can. And we're going to push the remainder into the desert. We're going to push the West Bankers into Jordan. We're going to push the people in Gaza into the desert, into the Sinai. And Egypt, to hell with you. And Jordan, to hell with you. That's what we're going to do. And then we're going to be greater Israel, and we're going to be safe. That is nonsense in what I just said. There's no way they're going to be safer. And they're going to be, as you said, a pariah. And those who back them to the hill, like us, are going to be the same.
That's what where the sort of schizophrenic response from the White House, where they sometimes say this or that, but then of course they have all those aircraft carriers parked right outside, and they keep sending all these weapons, and Congress keeps passing this and that resolution. Do you know anything about the situation at the top of the White House and who might be, under the not overtly, but like through back channels saying, please show some restraint here? Or what do you think is the way it's playing out at the top? Because I don't see this as being in the interests of the administration, except for one, I guess one caveat would be it has distracted from Ukraine, but I don't think that that's in a positive way.
I think they welcome that. I think they welcome that because they were getting ready to unload Zelensky. They were trying to use the Poles to do that. But the Poles, while being a little bit angry with him for the farmers market and such, didn't do their job properly. And so along comes Gaza, and now the distraction is sufficient so that they can get away with ignoring Ukraine. And Ukraine's having its own political problems right now. The head of the military in Ukraine is leading Zelensky in the polls for the election coming up. Here's what I think is happening, though, with regard to your specific question. Blinken, Sullivan, and Biden have had some second thoughts. Why has Biden had second thoughts? Because he is losing around 100,000 progressives every week. They are going away from him in terms of voting for him in 2024. They're disgusted with this situation. that's going to cost him the election. I don't care who the Republican candidate is. So he's got to really start thinking hard, and I think he is already, about how he regains some of these progressives. He's got to look like he's doing something, even if it's cosmetic. He's got to look like he's doing something. So I think Austin has delivered a signal, Secretary of Defense Austin. I think Blinken has delivered several signals. I think Bill Burns is delivering some heavy signals. It is unfortunate that the only true diplomat in the Washington administration is Bill Burns, who is malpositioned as director CIA. But you note they're using him for almost everything that's serious, like hostage release. So it's a mixed bag, but I think the domestic politics, thank God for domestic politics in this regard, are going to push Biden more and more to doing something, at least, that even if it's superficial in essence, that looks like he's got some concerns, some humanitarian concerns about what Bibi's doing. And he can't be in love with Bibi. Bibi has dismissed him so many times, dissed him so many times. I can't see how any American president would look at Bibi Netanyahu and not just feel like he was an anathema. He's such a disgusting character anyway. And his prolixity with English makes him even more disgusting because he can lie in English, just like Donald Trump. He can lie in English. I think they are doing some things. I just don't think they're doing enough, not in my view anyway.
Right. Now, Netanyahu is a guy who I trace some of this, and I think Ukraine in a way, and the war on terror, we can all, up to the present day with what's happening in Gaza, I look back to the mid-1990s, and you had, a few years after the Cold War ended, you had Russia and China, and they started making statements about how they didn't like the fact that it was a unipolar world, and they wanted to move toward a multipolar world. There were actually statements to this effect back then. And it seems like the response from the U.S. empire, we could call it that, and different factions of it, was to really get ahead of this, because around that time, I think it was 96, you had that clean break document, which I believe Netanyahu was involved with, and maybe other people like Bernard Lewis and Richard Pearl. I know that some of those hardliners were a part of it in both Israel and in the U.S. And then you also had the CFR. They commissioned Brzezinski to write the Grand Chessboard, and that's basically an anti-multipolar manifesto. And then a couple of years later, you have Project for a New American Century. A couple of years later after Brzezinski, you have the Project for a New American Century saying essentially the same thing: global dominance, full spectrum dominance. So between like the sort of realists, like establishment realists like Brzezinski, and the Likud people with the clean break, and Project for a New American Century, their neoconservative, craziness, which is also intertwined with very pro-Israel people, there was just this decision after the Cold War that they would not allow the rise of a counter-hegemonic bloc in Eurasia, essentially, and the Middle East is a big part of that story as well. And now that it seems like everything has failed, the 9/11 wars, the Arab Spring wars, NATO expansion, and now even on the Israeli side, they're going for this final solution, it seems like, when they don't really have the wherewithal to do it. I mean, it just seems like all of these things have led to this moment, and it's just failure all around. And you were there for some of that, you were close to these higher circles there during this time period. What are your reflections on on this era, and what is the influence of Israel in guiding this? Because it seems to be a big part of the whole strategy. In retrospect, it kind of becomes even more. I mean, a lot of people said this at the time, but what has been Israel's role in this, and how does the U.S. deal with such a huge total failure across the board?
Well, you've asked a number of questions, and some of them are quite complex. But let me try to at least simplify one line of thought there. Israel has always had inordinate influence since 1948. With some presidents, they had less, though. Ronald Reagan, for example, famous for selling AWACS and F-15s over stringent Israeli objections to Saudi Arabia. H.W. Bush forcing them, and I was there when this happened, into Oslo, ultimately. That's why H.W. Bush lost in 1992.
Explain that. Why do you? Oh, yeah. Why?
AIPAC pitched its total support behind Bill Clinton. Money, influence, everything it could pour there. Go back and look at that. I analyzed that for Powell when he was chairman, and he said to me, HW is going to get a second term. And I said, don't be so sure. Don't be so sure. He took me to task for weeks over that. And then when we got down to the elections and just short thereof, and HW pulled his Secretary of State, Jim Baker, and made him his campaign manager, Powell got worried because he knew Les Aspin was coming with Clinton, and Les Aspin had threatened to cut the military even further than we had under H.W. Bush. So AIPAC was largely responsible because they hated the fact that HW had Bibi Netanyahu's branch, the fact that they had not just assassinated Yitzhak Rabin. There's another story. Bibi incited the crowds that produced the assassin of Yitzhak Rabin, the architect of Oslo. They made sure that HW lost and Clinton came in. Then Clinton was dedicated to paying the Jewish community back. Therefore, he did all manner of things that were influenced by Israel, to include setting up a committee of the chairman of the board and other dignitaries from the military-industrial complex to decide whether NATO should be expanded. They came back to the president and said, this is a wonderful idea. Let's expand NATO. They could sell F-16s to Poland and other Warsaw Pact members. It's more complex than that, but it started with Bill Clinton, and I was there. I saw it start with him. I saw what Aspin did, then I saw what Perry did. I was taking Marine Corps War College seminars to speak with Bill Perry for hours in his office after he would just come back from Russia, for example, one time, and to speak to General Shalikashvili in his office after he took over from Powell. Their whole intent was to do exactly what H.W. Bush had set in motion with Shevardnadze, with Gorbachev, and then with Yeltsin, and with others. And that was to bring Russia into Europe. Bring her into Europe and even make her eventually a member of the political alliance aspect of NATO, if not the military alliance. We were not sure the military alliance would really stay vibrant, but we figured the political alliance could maintain itself and the transatlantic link that went along with it for at least another 10 years, perhaps. All that went to hell with Bill Clinton, and every president thereafter followed him. And we turned the entire process into exactly what you said. There will be no hegemony. Now, those people were there with H.W. Bush, too. I remember when Paul Wolfowitz, in the bowels of the Pentagon, there's a name you should recognize, wrote the national security strategy for Brent Scowcroft to give to H.W. Bush. Brent dutifully gave it to H.W. I'm quite confident Brent gave him some recommendations, too. And Bush took that document and wrote on it, send this back to the crazies in the basement of the Pentagon. That was H.W. Bush, the most experienced president we've had since Eisenhower.
They
so
leaked
he said
that, right?
no.
Didn't they? They leaked that eventually, and it became a little sort of scandal. Like if you follow it very closely, you know the story, but very few people do. But somebody leaked it, and because it was madness. I mean, it was like we will rule the world forever.
In 2002. Powell hands me the national security strategy that Condi has just had written. I read it and I say to my boss, wow, this is the same thing HW sent back 10 years ago and said, crazies in the basement. We put it in effect in 2002. I have to say this about my boss. His memory was a little bit slow there. He said, I read it. I don't see anything wrong with it. I said, boss, it says, in categorical terms, anyone who sticks their head up anywhere in the world, we are going to bomb the shit out of. That's what it says. I put it in that colorful language. And he said, I better read it again. In any event, it became our strategy, our national strategy. And you're right. It is preposterous to think that we have the power, especially in this day and age when our power is dwindling in almost every aspect. And we have $33+ trillion in aggregate debt. People are not buying our treasury notes or are dumping our treasury notes because of that debt. It's preposterous to think that we can stand at the top of the mountain and okay, there's a little country down there that wants to do something bad. We don't like it. Let's bash them. That's essentially what we're doing. Now, let me add hastily, Joe Biden is not an idiot. I mean, he's a little old, but he's not an idiot. He was one of the few people during some of this build up to this kind of strategic outlook who said, can we do this? Is this really what we should be doing in the world? So I know he's got some sense in that. And he's got some sense of the dire straits that the economy's in, and other people are, pointing out things too. So I don't know how that's impacting things now. I don't know how his age is impacting that, but we desperately need a Congress, and we desperately need a White House that understands the realities of power and begins to attenuate the abuse thereof that has been so omnipresent for the last 20 years, especially since 9/11. That kind of kicked it off. That let it go because these guys got what they wanted. They got their Pearl Harbor, as they said in the Project for a New American Century Clean Break report. They needed a Pearl Harbor. They got it on 9/11. Didn't have to be. And Powell told the president it didn't have to be that. We could handle it differently, he said. We could handle it very differently. We don't need a massive war and all that. If you want to go to Afghanistan and pound a few heads and then leave 6 months later and say, do it again, and we'll come back and pound you again, that's fine. But we do not need a protracted war, Mr. President. Well, look what we got.
Right. And it's interesting that you mentioned that about the Israel lobby potentially being decisive in Bush's reelection, because after winning in the Gulf War and beating he basically presided over a big military victory with the Gulf War, and then also winning the Cold War in the same presidential term. I mean, in basic terms, I know it's more complicated than that. So how does he lose?
Well, that gave him the leverage to get the Madrid conference. That because we had told the Israelis during the first Gulf War, you will not enter this. If you enter this, we'll bash you. And we sent people to Israel to make sure they didn't enter it. We were afraid Saddam would shoot some Scuds there, which he did. He did shoot a couple of missiles at Israel, and they would react. Well, Bush told them, you're in handcuffs. You don't do anything because we got 625,000 people in this coalition. We got Syrians, we got French, we got Saudis, we got Turks, we got Egyptians. You're not going to disrupt that. If you enter this war, you will disrupt that. We recognize the fact that I've been saying for so long that Israel's a strategic liability, not an asset. And they corresponded with what we wanted because they didn't have any choice. Well, that really made the right wing in Israel angry. And Oslo made them even more angry because their goal has been all along to eradicate the Palestinians. Just eradicate.
This is so obvious. I mean, it's the only way that explains all of their, otherwise inexplicable decisions and the way they handle things, is that they've just been biding their time for this. But perhaps that's why, with the U.S. empire, and U.S. hegemony really evaporating, that this is perhaps why they, upon getting a pretext, have decided to go for the maximalist response, because perhaps they see the window closing for them to be able to act this way, and they're so fanatically devoted to this. It's like they're so steeped in blood. They're like, well, we can't go back now until we finish the job. I mean, it's an insane mentality that must prevail over there.
You could have a point. I won't argue that too much. One thing I left out of that was how Netanyahu became so successful as finance minister and propelled himself into the prime ministership. He was buying oil from Mark Rich at discounted prices. Mark Rich was getting it, violating sanctions from Saddam Hussein, and he was pumping it into Israel. Well, the reason Netanyahu's economic record looked so good and made all the Jewish members of Israel absolutely not love him, but absolutely be content with him, was because their economy was booming. More billionaires per capita than in the United States. And we have a god-awful lot of them. So that criminal activity by Netanyahu and Mark Rich went to jail, of course. And who pardoned him as an ignominious final act in the Oval Office? William Jefferson Clinton. Mark Rich was a crook, a huge crook, as bad as the guys who sell guns and such. He was passing this oil around the world and to partners and to friends like Bibi Netanyahu. That was dissipating somewhat because the Syria problem had cut off that pipeline. There's another story. Paul Wolfowitz got Tommy Franks to bomb a particular oil head in Syria without Rumsfeld even knowing he'd given Franks the order in order to prevent oil that was going to Haifa from being stopped from going there. You've got a situation now where, for example, the Gaza entity was going to share 50-50, as I understand it, the gas and oil coming out of this very rich, possibly, field in the Mediterranean. Now Israel has abrogated the contract. They did that right after 7 October, and they're going in there solely to exploit that because they're losing that ability to get that discounted oil elsewhere, which will be a real blow to their economy. Now we're beginning to see the whole tapestry here. How we've been helping them, how they've been helping us, and how all of this has made a bloody-minded relationship that now is terminating in their final solution. And that's the proper phrase to use. It is their final solution for the situation in their portion of the Levant between the river and the sea. It is to eradicate the Palestinians.
Yeah, and it's can you do that in this day and age? I guess we're gonna find out. But
question I ask myself every day. I mean, people point to me and they say, "Oh, look what we did to the Native Americans. Look what we did to the slaves, especially after the Nat Turner revolt, when the slaves actually got guns and killed some people down south. Look what we did." That was 170 years ago. If you even look at what we did to the Japanese, for example, during World War II, that's a long time ago. Don't we learn anything? But there are people who use that argument. They'll say we ethnically cleansed our entire country. Why are we getting Bibi for doing it in his region? Yeah,
they didn't have TikTok and back then, so we didn't have to look at it, or we didn't see it in high definition right in front of us. I mean, it's really horrific. I want to ask you about something in particular, because what you said about the Bush HW's reelection is something I've thought about in the past, and that possibility of that being something that could have led to his defeat, that the Israel lobby's involvement could have been a part of that, has been registered in my mind before. But do you think it's possible that at the end of Clinton's, in the second term of Bill Clinton, I mean, given what we've seen with like Epstein and Maxwell, and his sexual blackmail connections and the fact that he belonged to intelligence, but he seemed to be more of like, it seemed like his operation was kind of outsourced to Mossad, like maybe the CIA is having them handle some sexual blackmail things because it's kind of sensitive and you'd rather have it really out of their wheelhouse in a way. I mean, do you think that it's possible that the Lewinsky thing and the, Bill Clinton signing the Iraq Liberation Act, that like that sort of Zionist neocon nexus, involved with clandestine world may have been involved in that whole affair? Because there was a lot of weird stuff going on at that time period. I mean, you had the FBI investigating people that were some Congress people and finding out they were having affairs. You had all these wiretaps of different people, the Turkish lobby getting involved, and it all traced back to different neoconservative actors. I mean, there was a lot going on there, a conflict that we still don't really have a full understanding of in the second Clinton term. I mean, do you have any insight into that?
Let me just answer that with this comprehensive answer. The most dangerous, insidious foreign agent operating on American soil is Israel, normally through AIPAC, but they have other means as well. They are the most dangerous foreign agent operating on our soil. And the implications you just discussed are the surface of that. You can go through the last 50 years, but particularly the last 20 to 25. And you can pick out, as you were doing there, examples of how this has worked or not worked over time. Most of the examples you would find have worked, and they've worked in the favor of Israel. Now, is there a reason the United States tolerates that? some strategists, some of whom I have respect for, like John Mearsheimer and others, would maintain very simply that the reason we tolerate this is because we think otherwise we'd have to be there in force doing what the Israelis are doing for us. Think about that for a minute. We think all these people are potential terrorists or potential entities that are inimical to our interests in the region. So we buy the pain and the agony of dealing with people like Netanyahu, or before him, really, Ariel Sharon. Remember when he led the invasion of Lebanon in '82 and we had to bail them out and had 242 Marines who died for it? The greatest death toll for the Marine Corps, single day death toll since Tarawa. So this isn't something new, but we tolerate all that, according to these experts, because we'd have to do it if Israel weren't there. And so
but is it even deeper than that? I mean, what I think is, what you're saying is a sound argument about Israel as supposedly this aircraft carrier in the Middle East. But what I have focused a lot on the clandestine state and the way that covert operations and clandestine statecraft have influenced U.S. and global politics. And one tactic that the U.S. uses is to outsource a lot of these things to satellites, like, the Saudis at different times, or the Iranians, Savak back in the day could do this, or different little outfits all over the world. And I mean, Israel, because they're so fanatically devoted, and they have a totally ends justifies the means sort of mentality overall. I mean, are they doing even more than that we don't even know about? Like, if we outsource some of the darkest things that underpin this empire to the Israelis, and is that a source of their domestic and international power as well? I mean, do we even know why they're as powerful as they are? Because I don't understand how they can get away with this in broad daylight. Even I'm shocked by what is happening now.
I think you've stumbled onto something that is always an adjunct, if you will, or a disadvantage in terms of this kind of strategy, using another state entity to do your dirty laundry. And that is that if that state becomes very powerful in a specific area doing that, and then begins to ignore you most of the time, you've got a problem because you can't control it. It gets out of hand. You could look at Ukraine and say that to a certain extent. We sort of, target of opportunity fell in there with Zelensky. I was managing the Ukraine account for Powell in 2002 and 2003. And I went in one day and I said to him, this is a kleptocracy. This is not even anywhere close to a Jeffersonian or even a democracy. This is a kleptocracy. Yulia Tymoshenko is as crooked as the guy she replaced. And he would say, well, they are a country of a lot of people. And I would say, we don't want anything to do with this country. Then imagine my surprise later when I figure, oh, they're talking again, because in '92 they were talking about this. Different way, though. They were talking about it as Europe whole and free. We forget Russia's a part of Europe. Ukraine's a part of Europe. So we were talking about it in a very positive sense. H.W. Bush was. And so was Gorbachev. Gorbachev thought that was a terrific idea, although he was very suspicious of us. He was. Powell would tell me about some of his suspicions sometimes. Sometimes he would talk to Powell more straightforwardly than he would with the president. So that was a different sort of looking at Ukraine then. Now the look at Ukraine was for NATO. And that all came about, that transition in thought came about with Clinton. Georgia, my president goes to Georgia in 2002, I think it was, and from the public square announces that Georgia will be a member of NATO, with Saakashvili right there beside him, who incidentally I think now is the mayor of Odessa. Isn't that interesting? Georgians get around. After all, Stalin was from Georgia. It's a far cry from what was anticipated at the end of the Cold War. George H.W. Bush made a very clarifying statement one day when he said, we will not thump our chests. We will not. Everyone understand that? That was the National Security Council. Everyone understand we will not thump our chest. This is not a moment to go out and stand on the mountaintop and say, we won the Cold War, ha, ha, ha. We're going to be decent about this. Prudence was his middle name. Prudence and pragmatism were his middle name. We haven't had that since.
No, we don't. We do not have the statesmanship at the top of the U.S., and that is the terrible, terrible crisis of the moment that makes it impossible for us to resolve other crises. I did keep you longer than we had talked about earlier, so I want to thank you so much, Professor, for talking about all of these issues with me, and I hope that you can come back on soon. And I'm really glad that you're out there because we really all appreciate from your insight and such.
Thank you. I appreciate those kind remarks.
Bryce Green, our man in Bloomington, how are you doing?
I'm doing all right. It's finals week, but I'm still alive.
That's good. I think you're going to make it. You're going to survive. You're going to make it to the holiday break, and then you're going to have a festive holiday season. But I want to talk about what Larry Wilkerson was saying. I really was happy to get to talk to Larry again. And since I updated my computer last time, I get this weird audio glitch that makes it sound like he's a robot from another dimension, or another universe, maybe even speaking across the void. And so I closed it, and I ended that a little shorter than I would have otherwise because I wanted to ask him more about Ukraine. But it was still really fascinating considering that he was there during the Bush administration and that he is so outspoken about the influence of the Israel lobby in U.S. foreign policy and in U.S. domestic politics. It's not often you have someone who is speaking so candidly based on insider experience. So that's really cool. What do you make of his comments and his analysis in light of what we're seeing going on in Israel-Palestine today?
Yeah. Well, as you said, like it's interesting to see someone who is, in the room, so to speak, when all of some of the craziest stuff, some of the foundations for what we're seeing today were being laid. Like he was there in the highest echelons of power, as an advisor to Colin Powell. And hearing his, I guess, seasoned take on things is always refreshing because most of the analysts we read and we hear are relative outsiders. Like even the journalists who have sources on the inside, they're still they've never been in a decision-making role on that. So it's interesting to see someone who does have that point of view, get their assessment. And some of the things he was saying about the motivations of the individuals involved and some of the pressures that they're acting on, talking about Joe Biden and how he and the Newland Sullivan apparatus, they're not stupid. They just have an idea for what to do, and they're reactive to the basic political pressures that we all know. Some of that didn't square with exactly how I look at them. But again, when someone is in that room and someone who knows Biden and has watched Biden's career, has experienced it firsthand, I have to take that into serious consideration.
Yeah, I mean, he says, I believe, as I recall, he said Biden isn't stupid, but what he's doing is stupid, right? That's what was about.
It was something like that. It was like
the shape of it at one point.
Yeah, it's what he's doing. He's not stupid, but the policy is at the end of the day insane. But who knows? Him talking about the Israel lobby is always interesting. It's always interesting to hear people who have had experience in the political system talk about the influence of the lobby. I mean, I'm at IU right now, and a few years back, they renamed the International Studies School the Hamilton Lugar School. Hamilton, of course, being Lee Hamilton, who is one of the major stooges of American empire. But even he
had a whole mythology around him. My mom worked for an Indiana congressman, and my mom is a very nice person, but isn't really somebody who thinks about deep politics. And when I was growing up, she would always say, "Oh, Lee Hamilton is a great statesman," and I know this was something that she had heard and then just transmitted. So there's a mythology around Lugar and Hamilton when both of them are really foreign policy ghouls, to be sure.
Yeah. But even Lee Hamilton let it slip. I don't know. In an interview in the 90s, he was talking about how the Israel lobby is one of the single most powerful lobbies in America, more powerful than oil, more powerful than like the weapons
He said
manufacturers.
that he said they're more powerful than oil.
I believe so. Yeah, I think this was a quote. I think it was in the Mearsheimer Walt Israel lobby book.
Yeah.
But yeah, like when people in power let it slip, like give an inside view, it's always interesting. And even Wilkerson, he said that the tip of the iceberg of what you were talking about with the Epstein blackmail network and the deep politics surrounding the Clintons and all that stuff. Like he said that was just like the surface level, like it's only scratching the surface. And he said, like, well, yeah, Israel's the most dangerous foreign actor operating on American soil, and it tracks with everything that we've been learning about. Collectively been learning about the Israel lobby, its influences, even just what we're experiencing on a daily basis. Like the fact that we could get that Alan Dershowitz could get Norman Finkelstein denied tenure, or the fact that even if you're on a university campus today, you're at risk of losing your job if you speak out in support of Palestine. Even at my university right now, they're investigating a professor for scheduling an event, a Palestine-related event. They're saying he falsified paperwork by calling the event academic. Like, it's all so stupid, but yeah, it's dumb. But the fact that they're able to wield this power, the fact that the pressures of every major institution in America has to deal with this in some way and accommodate it in some way. I mean, it tracks with it being a significant force in American foreign policy, even domestic policy. Like states are passing laws that that require that companies they do contracts with promise not to boycott Israel. Like state employees, like in Texas, they have to take oaths promising not to boycott Israel. Like what?
I think they go a little too far. I think they've gone. I think that is the situation for the U.S. in general in the world, and that is the situation for Israel now and in U.S. domestic politics and in its own situation. They had too much power and they use it stupidly, and they're going to run into the limits of stupidly exercised power, I think, and I think that we may be starting to see it, although I don't know how it's going to go down. It's like somebody who wins the lottery when they don't have that much wherewithal, and then all of a sudden they have that much money. It's like too much power. That's been the story of Israel and the story of the U.S. since the end of World War II. Like we created a situation where money called the tune, and a lot of well-funded, very dedicated people, dedicated to Zionism, put everything into making sure that this was a viable project, and it has the enormous significance to them, which makes them different than other lobbies, which are really just business. Like the Zionist lobby in the United States is something different from these other lobbies, and it has a dedicated and totally unscrupulous intelligence service as well as its servant. It is kind of horrifying.
Yeah. I mean, that leaked, I think I talked about it on the podcast before, but that leaked Al Jazeera documentary, The Lobby, from 2018. The first thing the first episode of it was them talking about the influence of the lobby on college campuses. They sent a guy and he was undercover working with like a group that worked with college campuses to advance, the lobby's goals. What they found was that these lobby groups, these campus lobby groups, they interface with organizations that are directly related to the Israeli intelligence, like the Office of Strategic Affairs. Like they consider this an important beachhead in their ideological war against Americans and the takeover of like American political discourse, and it works. I mean, it's an interesting documentary. If you see it in action, but they
got suppressed, but then somehow leaked. Is that how it happened?
Yeah, Al Jazeera, owned by the government of
Qatari royal family.
Yeah, and they have a complicated relationship with Israel, and they're primarily the funders of Hamas, and they've entered to negotiations, but they still react to the various pressures that they have, and there was enough pressure on them, Al Jazeera English, to suppress this documentary. But the Electronic Intifada, they got a copy. I'm not certain how, but they posted on their website. So if people want to go watch that documentary, it's on Electronic Intifada, and it's called The Lobby. It's very good, but it's just astounding the power of this foreign country over domestic politics. I mean, Chomsky says, and like I said, I'm rereading Fateful Triangle, which is an excellent book. It's like deja vu, the same justifications of the same situations being reprised again. But the way he puts it is that it's not that they don't actually believe that there's a serious risk of support for Israel being undermined like tomorrow. It's like every little bit is an opportunity for that to spread. Every little bit of anti-Israel sentiment or criticism of Israel is a chance for that to spread. And so the mentality becomes completely totalitarian. Like if they lift their heads up, any professor saying something mildly critical, well, they want to put pressure on that to make sure that anyone who does that understands that there is a severe cost to doing that. And they've managed to change the political economy of the entire country.
Yeah, I mean, and the result is that they empower the worst elements to do what they do, and then they generate opposition dialectically because they're foolishly pursuing short-sighted, kind of maniacal policies. I mean, the eliminationist version of Israel that didn't really need to be. They could have not settled the West Bank and just they didn't have to keep shrinking Gaza. They had enough land to be viable there, considering they had support of the United States and so on. There's really no reason for them to think that this is essential for them. They could have made peace, try to let bygones be bygones and so on. But
so
they
many
just have
times
not done this. They have not done this, and this is I don't know what I don't understand now is how. Well, I won't say I totally don't understand it, but it is very dismaying that they are pursuing what they're pursuing now in Gaza, which does not seem to be a military operation. People are saying, "Oh, you're just killing too many civilians. This isn't the way to go after Hamas. You'll create more Hamas." And then, like, they are aware that they are not eliminating Hamas. It only makes sense as a land grab, and yet that conversation is not being had. They're not having the conversation of should Israel be allowed to steal more land from Palestinians. That seems to be the only way to understand what they're doing now. And we're not even having that conversation. I mean, this is a way. Instead, we're having a debate we're arguing over whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, which is a joke of an argument. It's like saying, is a cat a dog? I mean,
yeah.
It's amazing to have this kind of power and get people to accept these kind of absurdities.
And the House just passed a resolution designating anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism. Like they just did that shit.
Yeah.
But this whole idea that this is a war against Hamas, it's a problem with the general framing of this war, even among like critics of the war. And part of this is a misunderstanding, but the other part is just like rhetorical necessity in this climate, this political climate that we're in. But the starting point for every discussion, especially among the liberal audiences, is that, well, yes, Hamas is awful and should be destroyed, but the cost might be too high here. Consider doing something else or easing up a bit. The line, Hamas doesn't represent the Palestinians, or just like Netanyahu doesn't represent all Israelis. It's a sort of way of doing most of Israel's work for them. It's a way of accepting Israel's frame that Hamas is a genocidal, anti-Jewish on principle organization who just wants to attack Israel. Well, if that's true, if Hamas is like Al Qaeda or ISIS, well then the only question is, how do we deal with that? And then reasonable people can disagree about how many civilians is acceptable to kill towards that end. But that's based on a completely false premise, because that's not what Hamas is. Hamas is, it's an Islamist organization, but they're more moderate than Israel. Like, they've accepted a two-state solution years ago, like decades ago. They've said that, even when they were doing suicide bombings, they were explicit that they're only doing it to try and liberate the occupation after 1967. They weren't trying to destroy the state of Israel. They weren't trying to, eliminate Jews from the Middle East. But that's been the propaganda for the last, 20 years. And Hamas has repeatedly offered Israel and indicated to Israel that they're willing to go to the table on a serious two-state solution. But Israel has been the more extreme party in completely rejecting that. And so,
or they make offers that are so absurd that.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what happened
No
after
one
the
would.
Hamas's election. Hamas was elected in 2006, and part of the deal with the PA was they were going to accept Israel at the 67 borders. They were willing to, share governing responsibilities with other Palestinian factions, and they were willing to, if not directly negotiate with Israel, negotiate through the PA, which is through the PLO, with Israel. They were announcing their willingness to do that, but Israel, they said no. You have to recognize previous agreements, including Oslo, which Israel was violating at the time. So it's really one-sided. And they also had to recognize Israel's right to exist, which accepting Israel and its existence and not fighting that is very different than recognizing the legitimacy of Israel and saying that they have a right to be there. Because it's the difference between saying that America is here and saying that America should be here. Like, America is here and no one denies that. And even Hamas leaders were at the time saying, look, Israel's here. We will accept 67 borders. And by definition, that means there will be some state beyond those borders, but I'm not going to legitimize it with my, support. I'm not going to say that it's right to be there. That's a moderate position. And that's something you could go forward with in any serious peace settlement. But Israel refused that. They said that they're not, they don't recognize Israel and they don't like Oslo, which we're violating. Therefore, we can blockade Gaza. And then the blockade caused a lot of internal fighting, and which led to the plan-supported Fatah coup, which led to Hamas taking over the Strip. And even after they took over the Strip, I mean, they weren't firing rockets at Israel until Israel started invading Gaza, fighting against other Palestinian militants. So this whole idea that Hamas is some irreconcilable organization that needs to go is false.
No, a blockade is an act of war, by the way.
Yeah,
so
it's an act of war.
They can't. They're waging war against Hamas by having a blockade against Gaza. So
exactly, and so that's why there's talk of a ceasefire. I mean, like they say that there was a ceasefire before October 7th. Well, I mean, only in the narrowest sense that they agreed not to fire rockets and Israel agreed not to drop bombs. But the fact is that Israel's structural violence, which is the major grievance of the people of Gaza against Israel.
I mean, a blockade isn't structural violence. A blockade is an act of war. I mean, that's why President Kennedy in 1961, when they put the blockade around Cuba, they didn't say blockade. They called it a quarantine. But the reason they use the euphemism is because it is understood that a blockade is an act of war.
Yeah.
So they were already waging war on Gaza. I mean, the blockade itself is an act of war.
And they continue to do so. And every
if the blockade is in place, then they are at war with Gaza. And then what do you say? Then at that point, anything coming out of Gaza is, there's a parties at war. I mean, they can't. If they're having a blockade, they're waging war on Gaza, and they can't say that Gaza's not, or that the people the Palestinians in Gaza are not. I mean, it's absurd the way it's discussed. This isn't even pointed. This is very rarely pointed out that they're already at war with Gaza. They're waging war on Gaza just by virtue of the fact that it's blockaded.
Yeah, and it just underscores just how much Hamas has been willing to accept, been willing to accommodate Israel. Because every ceasefire agreement since Gaza took over the Strip has included obligations for Israel to lessen and reduce the extremity of the blockade. And Israel, they violate this every single time. They increase the blockade. They keep, regulations of how far Gazans can go out and fish. They keep all this control without loosening it in any reasonable way. And so when Hamas responds to that, uh, in any way, that's considered a violation of the ceasefire. Well, that's totally false. This whole framing of the issue is hard. But if you but when you talk about like, well, Hamas doesn't represent the Palestinian people, we can attack Hamas without attacking the civilians, you're doing Israel's work for them. They know that Americans are predisposed to, even if they're more reasonable minded, they're predisposed to accept a certain number of civilian deaths. Like the civilian casualty files, people don't even know about that. It was New York Times reported them like last year, and they showed like how the Pentagon doesn't care about any of that. But Americans, if they're willing to say, if they're being told like this is for some good cause, which is sort of how the New York Times framed it, well, then again, like I said, reasonable people can disagree about how many thousands of civilians should die for that cause, and that's what we're debating right now. How many thousands is too many thousands? Is it 20,000? Is that too much? No. Okay. Well, maybe it'll be 15,000 or 50,000. It's just a horrific way to talk about this issue, and it gives them the high ground.
Yeah, I mean, it's there doesn't seem to be any pressure coming from the U.S. to be able to deal with this. It somehow is going to have to play itself out in a different way rather than expecting any statesmanship. I mean, if the Congress just passes that absurd, like it's a logical absurdity of anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism. It's as though you've taken the wealthiest, most technologically advanced country in the world, and it's 400 plus elected representatives, the elite of the elite somehow in theory, and you've gotten them all to agree that 2 + 2 = 5.
Yeah,
it's nonsensical and it's absurd, and they're all in agreement for it. This is a kind of totalitarian idiocy that can only be explained by reference to a political despotism that makes people believe absurd things and recite them as though they are cultists. This is not going to look good in the future, if there is any future.
yeah.
But I want to take a moment, or I want to shift gears here and go talk about another issue where the U.S. empire is not doing very well. And I wanted to ask Larry more about this, but then my computer, as I said, it got really weird, so we cut it short. But it was good because it was about as long as we were supposed to go anyway. But it was great talking to Larry about this, so it was going to go longer. But I want to talk about Ukraine. And in particular, I have a new article coming out. It might be out by the time this is published, over at the Beacon, and it's on the debacle in Ukraine. And I talk about the Council on Foreign Relations and how they have been they represent the corporate capture of U.S. foreign policy from the World War II era up to the present day. And you can still see this guy, the president, flacking for U.S. empire here. And so I'm going to have some articles and that were written kind of far apart. The first one that has some good quotes, though. The first one comes from last year, and this was when there was still some delusion about the prospects for the counteroffensive taking off. But he says the conventional wisdom was that Russia was going to do really well, really quickly, might replace the government, that militarily the Ukrainians weren't much of a match. But the conventional wisdom was incorrect. The Ukrainians, after the Russian invasion, the resistance wasn't just valiant, but it was effective. And the U.S. and NATO rallied behind it, and that they'd been training them, and they put these sanctions in place. But then, as a result of this, the Russians defined their ambitions more modestly, moved their troops to the east and the south, and they've been in that phase for a while. Well, this is just the magic alternate reality of these people. I mean, what we know now is that Russia invaded with a very small force, a force that couldn't possibly have taken Kiev and occupied the country in any way. They were, and I pointed this out at the time, that it didn't seem that force ever could have taken Kiev, that like it was really some kind of a feint, really. And that just seems to be, and that should have been recognized at the time. So he's already misleading his readership with this. And what is the consequence of that? Well, we'll come to that. Now he's saying last few days there's a little shift, which is that after the sense had been that Ukraine was doing extremely well, I would say over the last week there seems to be a sense that Russia has adapted to some extent, has adopted certain lessons, concentrating its forces much better, grinding out certain progress slowly but on the ground. We've entered a new phase where what's going on is, again, I don't want to use the word stalemate because that seems to predict too much. But again, very concentrated battles in the south and east. Russia controls things pretty much in the maritime areas, and that's the backdrop. Okay, so he's saying it's a stalemate when really it wasn't even a stalemate back then. They weren't. I don't believe the casualties were always lopsided, and Russia could absorb more of them than Ukraine could. It became clear that it was going to be an issue of Ukraine's going to run out of men.
Yeah. War of attrition.
Yeah. And so these people are debating whether, what to do about it. And this is a roundtable at the CFR. So one of the guys, Stephen Hadley, I think he's a former national security official. And then now he's just here CFR flag because it's a revolving door between these two institutions. Hadley says, that's right, but Russia has resumed an invasion that began in 2014, and one of the questions I would raise is I don't think Putin has revised his objectives. His objectives are to incorporate Ukraine, and that remains. He shifted his tactics, and they seem to be working better for him than the one before, and that's worrying. Well, again, we know now that they wanted to end this war, but they wanted to end this war very early on. They almost did. So this isn't honest. Somebody else says, yeah, I would agree with that, of course, because this is all, groupthink here. It's changed in several respects, though. Russia now has lines of communication through Donbass, concentrated in one area. The terrain has shifted. Russia's now more on defense than offense, at least in some parts of Donbass. That puts more burden on Ukraine forces. Okay, so there's at least a sense that, Russia actually has this territory that it has pretty much control over, and now Ukraine has to do the tougher work of trying to take it back. At least that's paying homage to reality in some way. This other person, Polyakova, I'm going to agree and disagree. The goal is still to undermine and destroy Ukraine's ability as an independent nation that can develop democratically and integrate into Euro-Atlantic institutions. They're lying about the goal. The goal is not. The goal is just to
making this up. Like they're literally just making this up themselves. I mean, if they had paid attention to, well, even before the war, Putin's public statements, it has nothing to do with we want to control Ukraine. It has nothing to do with we don't want Ukraine to be democratic. All of that just came from Western commentators looking into their own crystal balls and not looking at Russia.
And also omitting the fact that their democracy was overthrown by the U.S. in 2014, which makes this all the more infuriating.
And omitting the obvious fact that a war would destroy Ukraine's democracy faster than, even if Russia got everything it wanted and like Ukraine didn't join NATO and, the Donbass region and Crimea, was shifted out of Ukraine's control. Ukraine's democracy would today be in a way better state than it is right now. Are they ready? When was this? Was this like last week or
this earlier part? This part of it the ones that I've read, as I recall here, because there's two different articles, but they're some of the same people. Like Haas is the people, a person in both of them, and he's the president, Richard Haas. So this one is from about a more than a year ago. The one where they have this round table of people talking. So this is when they were still just putting forward the brave face of like things are going well.
Okay, so this isn't before it became completely untenable with
no, but he has coming up. It gets back to the newer era, and you'll see how he's changing his tune, and it's just funny or sick depending on how you want to think of it.
All right, well, let's see it.
This second part here from her, I think, is just it shows this made up world. I mean, they're not part of the reality-based community. They're part of the imperial flacking community. And this says, the tactics have shifted because of the challenges Russia faced. Okay, this part. This follows a long pattern of how we've seen Russia's military operations take shape over periods of time where they kind of muck it up initially because they're not that good in a lot of ways, but then they adapt and they learn and they implement these adaptations over time. They're still taking huge losses despite that, but I do agree they have adapted. So again, did they muck it up initially? I mean, the early invasion, perhaps they did take more losses because with this small, basically expeditionary force, they went too far into Ukraine and took some losses there. I mean, there were reports of the Russians taking more losses than people would have expected when they invaded. But again, I think that this is a fundamental and deliberate misunderstanding of what Russia was trying to do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even if this was like in the middle of summer last year, even if this was
that's about. I believe that's about what it was.
Well, we already had the information about Boris Johnson's trip to cancel peace negotiations.
They won't acknowledge that, though.
Yeah, of course not. Yeah, we already have so much information about like the U.S. Saying that they don't want peace negotiations. Later, I mean, maybe I'm getting ahead of what you have next year. But later, I mean, we had Putin even produced a signed draft document of a pathway to a treaty, and that was recently confirmed by one of the chief negotiators. Officials. Yeah, one of the chief negotiators.
No, it's well known now. You can't really argue against it, I don't think.
Yeah.
So that'll come up. That I have a picture of that in the article. Haas here at the end says, "What should be our definition of success?" This is a good question. This is the one that might come back to haunt you if people are paying attention years from now. I can think of a few. I can think of a return to the status quo of 1991, if you will, when Ukraine first became a sovereign, independent entity. I can think of, which basically brings you up to early 2014. I could think of us getting back to where we were 3.5 months ago, essentially to the 2014, post-2014 status quo that dominated for 8 years. Well, here, this is just imperial. He's in the imperial copium den, and he's really been hitting the pipe very hard, and now he's just saying things that people who are not as high as him will not understand.
Yeah, like this is gibberish. Like, I could think of getting us back to essentially no 2014, or essentially to 2014, post 2014. So no invasion. So he wants to get back to this boiling civil war. That killed a lot of people, like 14,000 people in the civil war. It's not a small thing, and of course it always risked spiraling out of control. And throughout that whole time, the U.S. They decided not to push for a peaceful settlement. They wanted the war to continue and keep.
So now that they decided, they did. It wasn't just that they decided to push for not allowing a peaceful settlement, not even a push to dictate no.
And well, I'm talking about the Minsk Accords. And they throughout that whole period, like there was a solution on the table, but then you had that RAND study in 2019 saying that a great way that they could antagonize Russia would be to increase support for the Ukraine side in the civil war, which would increase Russia's involvement, which would then might push them to invade. That was from the RAND study, and then, well, look what happened.
Yeah. Now we know about these peace talks, and as you were saying, there's just more and more evidence of this. Our guy, Ivan Kachanowski, who's a Canadian professor, very, straight-laced academic, and he did good stuff on the Maidan massacre and how it came from the opposition side, which has been vindicated now. But here he's saying this admission by Arestovich, ex-advisor of Zelensky and negotiating group member, the Russian side still insisted on peace initiatives, and the Istanbul peace initiatives were very good. An intermediary document. Now 200 to 300,000 would be alive probably, and half of Ukraine would not be destroyed and mined. They agreed to political discussions on Crimea. We made concessions, but the amount of their concessions was greater. This will never happen again. It won't. They will push more and more. So he's saying that the Russians were not doing what Haas said. Their goal was not to take over all of Ukraine. Their goal was just to have a negotiated settlement to this, and that would have meant returning to the Minsk status quo, basically. Like it was, Russia did not want this war. Russia attempted to have its security concerns addressed in the December before, right, a couple months before the invasion began. So they just refuse to report honestly on the position of the Russians, the motives of the Russians, and the history of what actually happened. This is remarkable. This is not the reality-based community. This is the foreign policy blob that makes up its own reality and thinks that because they're the history's most powerful actors, they just make their reality, and all the nerds are just going to study what they do, and that's how things will play out.
Yeah, I mean, and this again is the latest in a series of similar revelations. I mean, we had Naftali Bennett himself, the Israeli former prime minister, come out and say that yes, this is what happened. There was a peace deal, and the U.S. Helped scrap it. We had the Ukrainska Pravda report about Boris Johnson coming. We also had Putin himself come out with this draft document to talk about how there was a peace deal, or at least a pathway to peace available. And there were others too. I mean, there were diplomats talking about in Istanbul, talking about how the U.S. side seems completely committed to keeping this war going. But even if you didn't have all of that, again, just look at the facts. Like, do you think that Russia planned on conquering all of Ukraine with 100,000 soldiers? That's not possible. Like, it's it doesn't, yeah. I don't even know how to respond to that. But again, going back to what it's like on a university campus. Well, I was here. They had this big wall in the International Studies building, the Hamilton Luger. They had this big wall that said that it was like charting Russia's long-standing plans for genocide against Ukraine. And it just had like just factual inaccuracies on it. But the one thing that they cited for Russia's genocidal intentions now to like capture and destroy all Ukraine, it was Putin's the big speech that he gave a few weeks before the invasion, where he says that true sovereignty is Ukraine is only possible through partnership with Russia. Well, they just twisted that and said that, well, of course he wants to capture Ukraine, but they omit the parts where he says that that he respects Ukrainian sovereignty and that they want a partnership between the two countries, and they omit so much of that. And then the other statement that they use that's been floating around American media was just from a Russian TV commentator who said like some outlandish, insane, kill them all rhetoric about Ukraine. And their argument was that since he was a Russian television broadcaster and the state doesn't allow anything on television that they don't agree with 100%, then therefore that what he said represents the thoughts of Vladimir Putin. They live on fantasy planets. Like, this is the extent of their logical reasoning capabilities. But they're the people who are running the world, and so we're just in it, I guess.
Yes, and this is a big problem for us. And I, as bizarre as it is, I think that the situation in Ukraine is a debacle. Like, I mean, even the Iraq War isn't as big a debacle as this.
Yeah.
I mean, it is in terms of it cost more U.S. lives and was more expensive in the long run, and probably killed more people. Although it's getting close. But I mean, I think I heard Jeff Sachs say 500,000. You hear the Colonel McGregor guy saying 400,000. This guy himself, this Ukrainian, said 200 to 300,000. So I'm guessing probably 400 to 500,000. And the average age of the Ukrainian soldier now, Time Magazine reported, is 43 years old.
Yeah.
That means, what is that? I mean, that means there must be very few. There must be not that many people in their 20s, because
it means
for every person in their 20s, they have to be canceled out by someone in their 60s, basically, to get at that average age.
That age, like half the army is just like your dad, like, or your granddad.
It is. I don't know how they're going to avoid. If Russia wants them to surrender unconditionally, they can get that. They can do whatever they want militarily. And the only reason that they have not done more is because they didn't want to. They didn't want to. They could flatten Kiev. They could militarily. There's just such a mismatch that they could destroy it all, and that should have been clear from the beginning. I mean, maybe this was the thought was that, well, if Russia goes in, and then they'll go in like us and we'll just destroy everything, and that'll be really bad for them. They couldn't. Russia has absorbed many casualties and lost lives because it chose not to go scorched earth on Ukraine. At some point, that may register with the Ukrainian people, although I think there's going to be a lot of bitterness. But at some point, they have to realize that the U.S. is the one that really screwed them and gave them really nothing real, whereas Russia invaded and even then took care not to create massive numbers of civilian deaths. I mean, my understanding is that in Gaza there have been more civilian deaths in like a month than in the entirety of the war since Russia entered in February, a couple years
Yeah,
ago.
no, that's completely true. I mean, and Israel, they mobilized around the same number of troops that Russia mobilized to invade Ukraine, and that's just to attack Gaza, and the number of
Which is quite
bombs,
small.
yeah, which is it's quite small,
It's like
and
a
the number of
county.
civilian killed, yeah, like the rate of civilians being killed is extreme. It's worse than Ukraine. Like it's a worse attack than the attack on Ukraine, but it's just it's really indescribable. I mean, when you think about the rhetoric and the image of Russia that was portrayed in Western press when Russia was doing their attack on Ukraine, when that was just getting started, there were reports in American media about U.S. officials being like confused and baffled that Russia isn't doing like a shock and awe Iraq type thing and just blowing up Kiev. Like the U.S. would have loved that. That would have been great for American propaganda, but they didn't do that. They just lied about it. They said that that Russia was just, you know, doing a campaign of genocide. But when Israel's doing it here in Gaza, those same people nowhere to be seen, or
Yeah.
they'll do everything they can to justify it. That's just, I mean, the
They get paid.
propaganda system we live in is overwhelming. I mean, I keep coming back to that because, again, it affects you you see it every day, every news report, every time they refuse to call Palestinians under 18 children, every time they'll say Hamas run Ministry of Health, they know what they're doing. They know exactly what they're doing. These aren't stupid people. Like they know the effect of their words. They know the effect of their framing, and they know the credibility of the Israelis is almost zero. But they do it anyway. So this extends to our media system, our political system, and our everything. It's just totalizing. It's totalitarian.
Yeah, I mean, it goes beyond the obvious institutions which would be engaged in producing and disseminating propaganda, and it filters into the rest of civil society and sense-making institutions in general, in that people who are not propagandists and may not even want to have anything to do with the issue end up becoming propagandists, or functionally are acting as propagandists, because they understand that if they actually tell the truth about things, it will have consequences that are very real for them. And so in order to avoid incurring those consequences, they deputize themselves as propagandists. Basically, they don't want to confront this. I mean, even when I was a high school teacher, I largely avoided the issue of Israel because I'd seen lunacy. And I was at a private school, and I saw the ADL come in and really scold an administration, and because some very aggressively racist Zionist students had tried to say that the school was that Muslim students were able to get away with things that Jewish students weren't, because at some point they said you can't wear an IDF shirt because this is like a Quaker school, so we don't have any military things here. And then they did this ridiculous like agitprop thing, and then eventually it ends up like it gets written up in a little local paper. And the thing about it was the school was not, it was a Quaker school, but it was functionally like a Jewish Quaker school. Like the majority of the student body was Jewish.
But it was only these Zionists who were like these hyper Zionists who were like trying to make a stink and saying
right.
that they're
And then you end up with the ADL coming in and so on. And so I just thought, like, man, if they do that here at this little institution where it doesn't even like, it's a private Quaker school, in Philadelphia. Who cares? But if they would do that for this is just like a mindset that is fanatical, and you see it with the control of Congress and so on. I mean, I think that we probably don't know the half of it, and that's something that more people are realizing. And what do you do except for try to understand it better and spread the word about it? I think it's burning itself out in a way with its actions now, just like as aggressive empires do. I mean, it's an imperialist project, and they managed to intertwine themselves with the U.S., and that is where that's brought us to this. They've enabled us, and we've enabled them to do. I want to say we, the Americans, and we've fed each other's worst impulses, and now there's these twin calamities in Ukraine and Gaza. The world must be just looking at this in horror.
Yeah, and right now, I mean, if you look at what's going on in Ukraine right now, the Russians are actually mounting a pretty substantial counteroffensive around different areas in there. You haven't seen a lick of this in the Western press. Like I haven't seen the name of the town Avdiivka in like Western press, except for like in passing. But it's a major city, like it's a major junction, much like Bakhmut, which received extensive coverage back when things were more optimistic over here in America. But it looks like Avdiivka is about to be, overran and in the next, couple weeks, in the next few weeks, month or so, and that's a major turning point. I mean, and there are all sorts of areas along the Ukrainian or along the eastern Ukrainian front that are, buckling under some sort of pressure. And there are even people who are suggesting that right now in the like the Western camp. I can't remember who exactly it was. It might have been Stoltenberg, or it might have been someone else. But they said, "Prepare for some bad news out of Ukraine." Do you remember who said that?
But it's that
I want to say it was Stoltenberg, but it was like last week. He said, "Prepare for some bad news out of Ukraine, like soon. Like just steel yourselves." It's like we still want to support democracy and stuff, but there's trouble ahead. And I mean, like that's the state that we're in. It's crumbling and kind of in silence. Zelensky's canceling appearances and canceling events.
State events.
He tried to. I think he tried to go to Israel, but Israel said no because he's still there. Like, no, you're not stealing our thunder. And then, meanwhile, on the political front at home, Zelensky's deeply unpopular.
I wonder why. He's just killed an entire generation of young people, and you think they'd give him some credit, right?
Exactly. But his defense minister is like, well, I don't know if you saw that big Time. I think we talked about it when it came out, but the big Time cover story about Zelensky, where his like staff members and his high command are saying like this man's delusional. He's the only one in here who thinks that Ukraine can retake Crimea and Donetsk and Luhansk. Like he's the only one here, and he won't listen to anyone telling him different. Like he's gone crazy, and now Zelensky, his defense minister, is polling at a higher rate than Zelensky is in Ukrainian elections. But
Probably anyone though, if you put anyone up there and you ask the public of Ukraine who they preferred, they would not opt for Zelensky over anyone.
Well, I mean,
it'd be interesting to know who's more favorable, Putin or Zelensky. That would be the interesting question to ask the Ukrainian public.
Well, it seems based on polls like it's not a complete blowout, but it is insane for a quote like a wartime president who's loved by the West, a media darling, someone like that. But he's always been just a fall guy. But I mean, like the guy that the U.S. backed before him, Poroshenko, he's part of the coalition that looks like they're about to, rock Zelensky's shit.
No, you think they're gonna do a Count Chocula coup and put that guy back in?
I don't think they put him back in, but I think
he's the chocolate robber baron. That's how he made his money is by. So that's why I always call him Count Chocula. He's my homie.
Yeah, and he's such a character. I mean, but even he was talking about. He was one of the people who was talking about like how this is really a war for NATO expansion. So I mean, maybe they'll be mad at him for his tongue slipping, but he's part of that big coalition with Zelensky and with that guy Klitschko, who is also a major U.S. stooge, who is the current mayor of Kiev.
You gotta feel sorry for him though, man. He took many blows to the head over many years.
Yeah, well, I'm sure that makes him more pliant for people like Victoria Nuland. But I mean, this whole thing seems to be unraveling for Zelensky. A lot of that hasn't been in the American press, aside from that, the cover story. But the day-to-day grumblings of this, I don't know, something big is happening. We were all saying this when this war started. We were like, this guy Zelensky, he's going to end up like he's going to get like Noriega eventually, right? Like Like we're all loving him now. He's getting a lot of press, but he's throwing in his lot with the people who are like the most duplicitous people in the planet.
I mean,
And
he didn't have, to
gonna
be
come
fair, he did not, he got told how things were going to be. I think that he is, like the way that Leslie Groves described Harry Truman in the atomic bombings, he said he was like a little boy on a toboggan.
Yeah.
I feel like that's Zelensky. It's actually, I don't exactly feel sad for him because he didn't have to do it. Was narcissism that made him want to do this in the first place. But
yeah, well, he was a stooge from the beginning. I mean,
he was going to sign that agreement. He was going to sign that agreement, which would have been the thing to do, and he just got told no. And that was why he said didn't know. If he'd been left to his own devices, this war wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, the Minsk Accords. He would have. Yeah, because he.
No, I mean the agreement. I mean the Istanbul thing. I'm talking about the Istanbul. His government was about to sign that, and then the U.S. just said no. I mean, they were a signature away from it. The Russians had agreed to really reasonable terms, or they were going to basically restore the. As I understand it, they were going to rescind the recognition of Donbass and so on. I mean, this was they would have allowed them to have formal sovereignty over that, as long as they allowed them some autonomy and stopped shelling them. And Zelensky was okay with that. Apparently, they were one signature away. And then Boris Johnson says, "I've come with a message from the emperor, and you are not to sign this."
Yeah, I don't know if you got the chance to read that Lobster magazine article on Zelensky, but it's very good. It's very detailed about like the rise of this guy and how during his the campaign for presidency, one of his key backers was a guy named Igor Kolomoisky, who was a major Ukrainian oligarch on the board of Burisma, which, of Hunter Biden fame. But he's also the guy who funds he funded and helped found the Azov Battalion, which, neo-Nazi, pro-Ukrainian nationalist group.
Yeah, this guy's all over the place.
And he also funded the Sheikh Mansour Battalion, which is a battalion of Chechen,
jihadis.
Muslims. Yeah, they're jihadis.
He's got a McJihad. It's a McJihad franchise.
Yeah, it's like, a McJihad franchisee. And but this guy, Kolomoisky, is behind both of those. He himself is Jewish. He's funding radical Muslim terrorists and radical anti-Semitic terrorists. He's also got Zelensky. He also owns the television station that Zelensky's show, Servant of the People, was airing. And the way their elections work is that you're not allowed to show like political ads in the days leading up to the election. So what they did was they just aired Servant of the People for like a week over and over again, cementing like Zelensky as this presidential role. And in this Lobster magazine article, they note that the only break on this television station was to show a documentary about an actor who became president in America, our boy Ronald Reagan. But
there's a Ukrainian one of the. It's in Ukrainian. There's a Ukrainian language documentary on Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, but the funny part is when they dubbed Ronald Reagan's voice, guess who did the dub for the voice?
Zelensky.
Yeah. So
did he do a Ronald Reagan impression at least?
I don't know. I don't think I haven't heard it. So maybe it's really fun and really similar.
I'd like to hear Zelensky doing Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, but in Ukrainian, but trying to do the voice.
And that gravelly Zelensky voice. Yeah.
And they could have him with the dyed hair, that like Reagan had. I mean,
yeah. But the forces that brought Zelensky to power, I mean, it's very clear that he's a stooge in every way. He's an actor. He's a guy who got caught up in the political affairs that are bigger than him. And I don't even think he understands what's going on. But because he seems to have embraced this role as the savior of Ukraine. But anyone with any serious political chops would have understood that he's in a stooge role. If you read a book about history, then what happens to people who become American stooges like that. What happened to Noriega. What happened to Gaddafi. What happened to all these people.
Gaddafi didn't really ever become a stooge. He just tried to be friendly. He tried to have decent relations. But yeah, I mean,
that's true. But you can't make
the Hmong tribesmen. That's a good group to look at. What happens when the U.S. makes you its friend?
Yeah.
Suharto. The IMF and so on. The U.S. brings him up. 30 years later, gets rid of him. Mobuto, Hussein at one point. Mobuto, I mean, Hussein's problem was the U.S. didn't want Iraqi oil on the market. Like they had boosted him at one point and backed him to attack Iran. But when it came down to it, Iraq has so much oil that if they put it on the market, it would mess with the bankers and the oil companies and such,
Like you're
and the British.
subordinate to our needs.
So they're like, we actually need you to not. You need you to be an enemy, and that's where he got put. I think it was Zelensky. They should, to be kind, they should just take him, find one of their cocaine trafficking proxy armies where they're doing business, and put Zelensky in some sort of cottage there with an ankle bracelet so he can't really go around. He'll be in like witness protection sort of, and then he'll have an unlimited supply of cocaine and he can just retire that way and with with sort of a pension for his services to the empire, but paid in cocaine.
Well,
That
it's
seems
been
to be
reported
his
that
thing.
his like stash of wealth that they've been able to like skim off the top of this Ukraine aid deluge is like in the billions. So or at least 100 millions. So he'll be fine. If he
may be dead. He may end up dead.
Yeah, I'm about to say if he makes it through the war, alive, then he's going to end up probably in like Miami or some other country chilling for the rest of his life. And maybe he'll go on tours and he'll give speaking tours. Maybe he'll get an honorary position at like Columbia University lecturing on international politics. And people will take pictures with him. He'll get a book deal. He'll get a podcast. And but that's assuming he makes it out. If he makes it out, there's reward. But if he
may end up as one of those infamous people in history who really just got swept along without really having taking much initiative themselves.
Yeah,
I mean, he's almost like a different version of Lewinsky. So Lewinsky and Zelensky, they even rhyme, and then they're both kind of historically occupying positions of infamy that they didn't quite deserve, especially Monica. I think that the way that she had to deal with all that was not fair, and her transgressions were much smaller than Zelensky's. I mean, she was involved in adultery, so naughty Monica. But Zelensky, what do you even say? All right, I think that we have said enough about Zelensky now, and as much as we need to about Gaza and such for the moment. So Bryce Green, once again, thank you very much.
Aaron Good, thank you very much.
Thanks for tuning in. Please subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon for first access to Devil's Chess Club and for all new and past episodes of the American Exception podcast. And please check out 4diedtrying.com. These were 4 leaders who got taken out of the game. They were on the same quest for peace and justice. They had to pursue this as though they were part of a democratic society, but their enemies were essentially fascists. If they can't win the day through our rigged democracy, they can just murder their enemies. But now, even after having spilled so much blood, the empire is in a weak position, as we were just discussing with Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. Are we witnessing the end game on the devil's chessboard? It looks that way.